You're listening to Unlocking Our Sound Heritage, brought to you by Manx National Heritage, the charity responsible for the Isle of Man's natural and cultural heritage. The sound recordings you'll hear today and throughout this series on Manx Radio are part of a unique collection of around 600 sound recordings, digitised from the Manx National Heritage Sound Archive and available online thanks to Unlocking Our Sound Heritage. We hope you enjoy eavesdropping on the voice clips we've chosen from the Nation's Sound Archive, all of which can be listened to in full at imuseum.in. This week will be a little different from our other Unlocking Our Sound Heritage episodes. We are going to be diving into the Manx Language recordings. Now don't worry, you don't have to be a Manx speaker to enjoy this episode. We'll hear recordings in English about Manx, and I hope you will find the show interesting as we learn about how some of these recordings came about. Even as far back as 1904, academics and language enthusiasts made efforts to record the voices of native Manx speakers. But back then, technology was expensive, difficult to use and fragile. In the late 1940s, an amazing opportunity was presented to the Manx Museum from the Irish Taoiseach, Eamon de Valera no less. De Valera visited the island and he met with the director of the Manx Museum, and on learning about the decline of Manx, he offered to send the Irish Folklore Commission to help the museum record the old speakers. As we hear in our first clip, this offer of help was most appreciated, not only by the Manx Museum but also by the Irish Folklore Commission. Here's Irish folklore collector Kevin Danaher.
Yes, when the good Mr. de Valera visited the Isle of Man in 1947 and was interested to meet and to hear some of the older Manx speakers there, and hearing some of the difficulties in the preservation, of at least the preservation of the memory of the language, he promised his help in recording the last of the Manx speakers, and when he returned to Ireland, he applied to the Irish Folklore Commission as somebody engaged in, a body engaged in similar work, to go to the Isle of Man and, with recording apparatus, and make the required recordings. And the good man was astonished and indeed horrified to find out that the Folklore Commission didn't have any such apparatus, because they hadn't interested themselves hitherto in it, although some of us who were working on the thing had been experimenting with this and waiting and praying for the day when we would get the financial support required for it. Well, when the head of a government is interested in something, usually something happens, and wheels turned, and wheels perhaps within wheels turned, and before very, very long money was available, so that we set up a recording unit. It was a disc cutting unit. You cut 16-inch discs, each of which had 15 minutes on each side, or 30 minutes on the whole disc.
So, thanks to the plight of the Manx language, the Irish Folklore Commission gained a much-needed piece of kit, a mobile recording studio. They purchased a van and kitted it out with recording equipment, making special adjustments to make sure they could make clear and true recordings while out in the field. After some initial tests, the van was sent on its first project to record the Manx speakers. They set off for the Isle of Man, and the transportation was, well, let's hear it from Mr. Danaher himself.
And we brought the thing over to the Isle of Man. Having tested it out, this was really our first. In those days it was an adventure. I drove down about 11 o'clock in the evening and had the recording van slung from a crane and dropped into the hold of a cattle boat which was coming over to Douglas. And then the cattle came in and they occupied the upper deck, and what shall I say, the effluent descended upon the lower deck. So in the morning it was rather difficult to see where the van was, especially as the van was a sort of a dark green colour and was more or less camouflaged completely. So I succeeded in getting into the van without too much disturbance, and then drove it from the harbour here in Douglas, where incidentally we were received by the Chief Preventive Officer, Mr. Kinvig, who helped us very, very much indeed, was very, very good to us, and drove up to the Manx Museum to be greeted with horror by the director thereof, Basil McGaw, a gentle soul who was somewhat perturbed to see the state in which we were. And he called to me from a distance, from a safe distance. He said, "Don't get out and close the windows." And he summoned a stout fellow with a strong hose, who hosed the thing down and succeeded in washing it fairly clean. And then we were ready to go ahead.
Oh dear. Well, thankfully they got cleaned up and on their way and made a large number of Manx recordings, which were all taken back to Ireland to be processed, and copies were sent back to the Manx Museum. The museum and the Folklore Commission were given invaluable assistance from a number of local enthusiasts who had taken an interest in Manx and already knew many of the native speakers. In this recording from 1948, you can hear the voices of two of the local enthusiasts, Mark Braid and Charles Crane, encouraging the main speaker, John Neen, to talk about gathering turf for the fire.
Gael tiredness. Will I go?
There they go.
Well, if I'm a done egg, when I fagging and slide go to the slade and the gather bone, out of Keelan. That collect bone was snail. She's the skelebrige. The feeling the lead, say. As is that, creek, jazz, credas from a jewder. As is when you would, how they would go gilly be with a land chin.
What do you mean, Gael?
And then says, or some say him with, Chiana Quag na Vian. All you won, but
Awesome.
lost there in Isle. As next tunnel weg just in go that Oliver Soul Gaelg.
That was John Neen talking about the practice of gathering turf for fuel being replaced by imported coal. John Neen was a blacksmith from Ballaugh and would have been about 96 at the time of the recording. The work between the Manx Museum and the Irish Folklore Commission led to further Manx-Irish cooperation. The archives contain many warm letters between the two organisations, and the continued advice and encouragement from Dublin helped cement the Manx Museum's own ambitions to grow the folk culture collections here on the island. With help and training from our friends in Dublin, the Manx Folklife Survey was launched in 1949. A group of about 30 volunteers led by the museum's Leslie Quirk went out to interview the older generation about their memories of Manx life and customs, keeping meticulous notebooks all later deposited in the archives. There was great interest in the project, and the following year the project attracted a very generous gift from the Reverend Fred Cubban, a sound mirror recording machine, so the Folklife Survey could collect not just written notes but also the sounds of the Manx language, dialect and folk song. The first recording made with the machine for the archives was recorded at a ceremony held to present the new machine to the museum. Clearly still getting to grips with the new machine, we start to partway through Mr. Moore's speech thanking Mr. Cubban for the new machine.
All we can of Manx folklore and speech, but we've missed a good deal of the old speakers because they've been too old or unable to be recorded with us. But now, happily, we have this machine, and we'll be able to get not only the old stories, which we've been collecting by hand and that kind of thing, but also the very valuable record of Manx speech, not only Manx language, but Manx dialect. So on behalf of the trustees, I think we must express our very great gratitude to Mr. Cubban for giving us this very useful tool in helping us in our future work. I think we're also very happy to know that Mr. Cubban is going to help another Mr. Cubban, a very famous director of the Manx Museum, who still continues more or less undiminished in his enthusiasm about Manx things, and who has a new book on the way. I'm sure the directors and the Manx public generally are very grateful to Mr. Cobham for his public-spirited help in both these directions. I think we ought now to invite Mr. Cobham to christen the machine by recording a suitable message to remind us of this day. Mr. Cobham would like to.
Mr. Chairman and gentlemen, it gives me very great pleasure to hand this machine over to the Manx Museum, and I know that your intention is to use it for making records of famous Manx people and also the Manx language and of Manx folk songs. And I'm sure that in the future, the records that you will have taken on this machine will be of great interest to those people who follow after us. I am sure that in giving this machine to the Manx Museum, I am only carrying out what my late uncles would have wished me to do, because they took a great interest in the museum and in everything connected with this island. And so, gentlemen, I have very great pleasure in handing it over to your care with the wish that you will use it to the good of the island and the benefit of our people.
Mr. Cobham's ambition that his gift be used to collect recordings before it was too late was not in vain. The machine was put to good use and a good number of recordings were added to the Folklife Survey. Many of the speakers enjoyed visits from the Folklife Survey and the opportunity to use their Manx. In the next clip, we hear from Leslie Quirk on interviewing Mrs. Watterson from Colby on her preference for using Manx.
From having to, so to speak, from having nothing else, she was a native speaker and from choice too.
Yeah.
The first choice was always the Manx. And I remember speaking to her once and said, it was a girl that was with us, and I said, how are you, Mrs. Watson? What is doing on you at all? He said, why couldn't you ask me in mine? So I did, and of course the others didn't mind either, because they'd come to hear it. But
she enjoyed speaking Manx and wanted you to talk to her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yes, and she would, if I spoke to her in English, she said, "What does she think I'd gone out of my mind or something?" You see, what was I thinking about?
Not all of the Manx speakers were so at ease with being recorded. Many of the speakers had not spoken Manx for many years and had trouble remembering the words. Others were shy or even suspicious of outsiders, but the Folklife Survey interviewers worked at building up relationships and trust to coax out what Manx they could. Sometimes people were more comfortable reciting or reading well-known Bible verses or hymns. Here we have Sage Convig from Ronig reciting a Manx translation of hymn In the Arms of Jesus, and then being asked to read a passage from the Bible. You hear her answer in English that she'd prefer to pick the passage herself before the tape breaks off.
Chat benannt Convig.
Sheer ensnit Rayachel, Yisa, sheer Erenakis Chris. Lorish a grey nish kudet, Fia village golmi ish. Clinic tekorene inland, Chit els arail nish down. Harris in Maracle grol, Harris King Jasper now. Seer els Rolakan Yisa, sheer as an Arkis Chris. Lorish ne grey hill kudet, Fia village golmi ish. Sheer elsen Rarakan Isa, sheer was merged as it rail. Sheer with it sail the vola, sheer esh was peggiest the tail. Sheer with a bliss the hechel, sheer was the dutten gear. Ger was the tre sal seekel, sin tail twas shille dear. The Isa thou ball kimra, Yisa who best and me, Mish I the Craig the Asian, Shiggy testil to me. Ferkach el shawless minid, Ferkach el shawless, Fugis ten ui e corn. Ferkach is hidden the vary, a train young brisher rum.
Schön mal Lüe. Schön Jendesack. Eh? Wat is dat?
It's a one out of Sankey's, it says here it is.
Well, you can't lose the lie. Put je schön.
You lie put in Bible and son. And
Wallaby.
Sen en shield cabdal jen social script Lord New Ian.
Well, wait a minute. Could I pick one myself? Would it make any difference?
That was Sage Convig, this time recorded by the Manx Language Society, one of a number of other organisations who also made recordings, now deposited with the museum and also made widely available through Unlocking Our Sound Heritage. As the speakers became more used to the idea of outsiders taking an interest in their Manx and their stories, Folklife collectors were able to make more relaxed recordings of natural conversations. Sometimes gatherings of native speakers would be arranged and then recorded. The next clip was made at a Manx Language Society gathering with Ned Madrill, Sage Convig and Tommy Lees. We hear Sage saying she's forgotten all of her stories in Manx, and Ned Madrill then offers his advice to the collectors on how to help Mrs. Convig be more forthcoming for the recordings. He suggests if they come and do her housework for her, she'd have more to say.
Oh, the red be yellow red.
Oh, they'll get the sulet.
Ah, yeah.
You can't listen.
You can do it.
So. Enough well skill be had.
Oh, they'll skill be really was soon.
You chit says there's a toyek. As cocoon jees on the Guinea an hour, ye go Gaelg that
Sure, well. So, been few week the inu shen, yes. Anel K, I must say.
Anel, for it?
K.
Anel?
Sometimes I wrote her out do it.
Hours a toyish.
Koi miss, yo. She told me, Jenu, aber the lure was a tie emis. Was a tie ingen to there.
Well?
This next clip is from later in the conversation. Now, you don't have to be a Manx speaker to understand the silence after one of the interviewers makes the faux pas of asking a lady her age and suggesting she's over 80. Although it quickly descends into laughter as they suggest she's 21 and tells her she looks younger every day. We can also hear Mr. Tommy Lees telling us he's Kier feed as Trijeg, 93, although nobody seems to notice in all the laughter.
Skrenesh is een nish van ons dat een weg. Dus smoene keer veel van
Die bracht hem kneest hem.
Nee, dat speed.
Nee, dat speed wel.
Wel, ik wel denen.
Dat speed dat is slow. Niet
Jeru.
Handel een vreemd.
Alle zo'n grey krenesh dat daar. Hoeveel is lal de gaven sis. En als kaart de grey.
Het is keer veel dat Trijeg.
Ah, skommer Anjabiti. En ali Jane veel shedden Anjabi. Ali.
Anel, de Jane mooi van een check. Dat is cash egg, hoor.
Te hem krapleggen.
Die gaven de zij de holje treed aan mij vragen niet.
Niet. Wel ik lijst in de Bregach niet.
Bregach, ja.
En heel schön Breger, hè?
Charlie Bregach, check mij goed.
Welk rail je hin is beneden?
In 1998, Walter Clark from the Manx Language Society gave his reminiscences of recording the Manx speakers in an interview with the Manx Museum. Here he gives his thoughts on the difficulties in recording the female native speakers.
For some reason, we've always had a lacking in fluent women speakers, or people who are interested, young women who are interested enough to learn to be fluent enough to go and talk to them. It was sad in a way because I suppose there were had there been somebody like me as a female, they could have gone to see Eleanor Cairn and Mrs. Convig and talked and got a lot more out of them on the distaff side of life, whereas we had to try and cover all subjects, you know. But no, it's that's one side we've missed out on, I'm afraid, you know.
There were some very well-known female contributors. Annie Neal from Ballagarrett was nicknamed the Mistress by the collectors. Here she is talking about Juan Gorn, describing his house and loom shed and then reciting a rhyme he would say while weaving.
We shan Juan Gorn as we bear on Marein, as we she on, as we tie toetjegge, as we kogi house toet, as we bol, den rest en kabelbeg as een boer. As we feast on bear, as we grey cock, and then we grey a marrow the me the jarro, then jerach the we brish, as gurish and bregen, wat koutjes os kaneel. Peggetjes, pregetjes, ma caragos ma wiel, as gurish and bregen, wat koutjes os kaneel.
The archive also contains recordings of cultural events, concerts, lectures and Manx church services. Our next clip is from a recording made at a performance of a Manx wedding in Laxey in 1952. The clip is from the performance preamble where the presenter is asking a child, Johnny, what his lines are going to be.
And tonight we're going to have just a little bit now from our children as well. And first of all, little Johnny Lawson is going to speak to us. Now, Johnny is 6.
What are you going to say, Johnny?
Oh, Bobby Bob. Ever heard tell of how Bobby Bob and his woman Margaret Ann, she used to call an oak with big slob when the bucket slipped out of his hand. And bless me soul the fuss she'd make when he played with the thumb over the soda cake. Bobby Bob she'd bowl wherever was down brought up at all, and Bobby would shout and answer her back, but ate away till his lips would smack. Don't noise like a muckin when thou eat, and put thy skin down the night way, and Bobby would say that quiet and slow, and pull it down where it's meant to go. Now Bobby weren't a bad thing at all, mighty fond of a drop for all, but then some saying a constant nagging and frown sent Bobby to town, his troubles to drown, and that's when herself would be on his track. For he didn't get out and he took back, but that's where Margaret Bob was stuck. She was like water on the wing of a duck. Glass she thought out he was in though. I'll give you how Bobby was for the next time Bobby goes to town, herself with a pig and travel around, and worked herself all into a fridge. Then off she goes to the dark bridge, and waited there for Bobby to come, saying, I'll kill you, rascal of rum. But Margaret hadn't to wait that long, for yonder was Bobby coming strong, with another bridge tapping his way, just like a ship in a heavy sea. I'll frighten him out of his skin, she said, and flung a sheet right over her head, and rushed to meet him with a scream before he was halfway over the stream. I've come to claim me, Bobby Carroll. Come now with me, for I'm the Joe. Oh, deep door, says Bobby, and he blinks and leers. Give us the hand, bro. I've lived with thy sister for 40 years.
Wasn't 6-year-old Johnny brilliant reciting Juan Noah's poem Old Bobby Bob? I'm only sorry we don't have time to play you the whole recording. So, if this programme has inspired you to practice your Manx, here is some advice from Sage Convig again, this time in English, speaking to Eric Regine and Walter Clark in 1959.
The handy little thing.
And yes, it is a wonderful thing, but I'm beginning to forget the Manx too.
Well,
well, it's a long time since I spoke much Manx out now.
Yes, you get off of something.
Yes,
yes, it's a job getting any practice with it now.
No practice, whatever.
No.
Only read.
Yes.
Yes, you're still reading the Bible
I can
fairly
read
often.
the Bible from end to end.
Yes.
And I'm wondering that if you fellas is learning Manx, that they don't read the Bible instead of the New Testament. It's newer Manx.
You mean the Old Testament is better?
Yes, the Bible, the Old Testament. You read about Joseph all the way down. It's a story in itself.
Yes, yes. And I believe the
Manx is far easier learned if you get the English Bible and get the Manx and you correct yourself. Wonderful.
Yes, yes.
Far more so than Mean's dictionary.
Yes.
I think that Mean tried to put a polish on the Manx. If you because he quotes it some places and he says it's in such a dictionary, and Kelly's dictionary. Kelly mentioned it, Christine mentioned it.
Yes.
And there's lots of things I think he got to polish up in the Manx.
I certainly think reading the Manx Bible is a basis you can't do without.
Yeah, you can't.
You can't, no.
But
no.
The New Testament is they're more learned when they wrote it.
I see, yes.
More education at it.
Yes. Well, what we want is the sort of Manx that people spoke.
The real old Manx is read Joseph and read David and read all the way down, and it's wonderful Manx.
Yes.
So there you have it. Mrs. Kinbig recommends doing what many of the early learners of Manx did, getting a copy of the Bible in both Manx and English and reading them side by side. Fortunately for us learners today, there are now a huge variety of fun and interesting Manx language resources to choose from. And if this programme has piqued your interest in learning a word or two, or more, check out learnmanx.com for more information on getting started. Thank you for listening to Unlocking Our Sound Heritage Manx recordings. Join us again next week for more voices from the archives, or in the meantime, listen again on the podcast available on the Manx Radio website. You can hear more snippets from our Manx language recordings next week at our lunchtime listen event as part of the Coosh Manx Language Festival. See learnmanx.com for details. Or, to hear these and many more sound recordings in full, visit imuseum.im and click on Unlocking Our Sound Heritage. To find out more about the charity Manx National Heritage and how you can support us, visit our website manxnationalheritage.im or join us on Facebook.